Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. Today I want to talk about consequences. So just kind of bouncing around, looking at different forums. Maybe it was even on my Discord. I remember a couple weeks back people talking about how to kind of handle consequences, right? We hear this a lot when we're talking about sandbox play, if you will, open world play, where the player characters are running around kind of doing whatever they see fit, and that kind of becomes the story of the campaign. What do we do when they do stuff, right? And usually this comes up when they're doing stuff that is, I'm going to say, bad. You know, they become what people often call murder hobos, right? They go into town and just kill random NPCs, or they just cause havoc, right? How do we stop player characters, especially when they get a little bit of levels behind them, and if you're running a more kind of what I'm going to call realistic world where, you know, not everybody's a 5th level fighter, right? So civilians are civilians, right? And most towns are not filled with adventurers, and people aren't wearing plate mail in the tavern, right? If you're running a world like that, like I am, then how do we handle this? And I've talked about this once before. I don't love the idea of sending Conan in to smack him in the face, which is basically what OD&D tells you to do, or a gold dragon or whatever, if players are being bad like that. I think that becomes a off-the-table discussion of maybe we're not in alignment on what kind of campaign we want to run. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about kind of long-term consequences. I mean, if you have players that are going into town and just being outlaws, then I think you just need to have a conversation. But so there's that part of the video. This part, though, is about what I think is much more interesting, which is players making impact in the world. And we can use the word consequences, but consequences kind of end up having a negative connotation. They should have, I think I've heard somebody refer to it as impact. Was that the Chris McDowell? Is that right? Let me know. And I like that. I like that idea of impact versus consequences. That is to say that when the player characters do something, things in the world can and should change to react to that. If it's a significant thing, then there should be significant changes. If it's a small thing, then there could be small changes, right? If they help the tavern keep by breaking up a fight, let's say, as opposed to starting one, then maybe they get discounted drinks, or they get better rumors, or they're just, you know, they get a hint when somebody's coming after them. Maybe if they help an army win a war or a battle, then they get places to stay, or a noble title, or potentially forces to help them when they need to fight something. And these are the types of consequences that I think can be really interesting in the world as we build up the campaign. And as you're thinking about your player characters, and this is kind of how I've seen campaigns generally run for me, kind of more open worldy campaigns, is when they are low level, they're focused on just kind of making their mark in the world, right? They're out there just kind of getting gold, fighting monsters, looking for, you know, ruins of ancient civilizations with magical items. And as they do this, they gain power. But the other thing they gain is influence in the world, and they gain connections. People that they helped, people they avoided, people that they ran from, people that they let live and let go. You know, all these people become a kind of swirl of moving parts in your world that can come back. And I think that's where consequences or impact falls for me. So I'm just going to give I've kind of made some little bullet points here of like some things I thought about when I was running various campaigns. So there is, no spoilers because I can't remember the name of it, but there is a Dungeon Crawl Classics module where if you kind of do a certain thing, basically it activates a bunch of warriors that are kind of, I guess, living statues, for lack of a better word. And there's like 100 of them. And this is like, I want to say it's a 0 level or 1st level. So it's one of those things where, oh, you know, what's happening here? You know, like, we better run because there's no way in the world the player characters can defeat them. Maybe it's a clever play, or maybe a generous judge might allow the players some way to defeat them or trap them or do something else. But in my experience, having run this twice, once kind of at a convention, but then once with people like in like a campaign, I guess it was more of like a sporadic campaign. They just run, you know, I mean, you release these warriors. There's a lot of them. You've got gold in your pocket, and you just want to live, right? It's DCC. You're 0 level, or 1st level. You're very low level. You're running away. Now, in the convention, which was like an online convention, That's it. It ends. It's kind of a fun way to end a short story with these soldiers like pouring out into the world. But in the campaign where consequences and things matter, what I would do is I would bring up every once in a while that this happened, right? Because we were playing things like a week went by, a month went by, a year went by. So, things would happen, right? They'd be in a town, 50 miles away and hear rumors of some, band of soldiers or a mythical army like destroying the crops and this. So they'd see things going on in the world, right? They never got to the point where they were high enough level that I could actually try to fix what they had caused. But it was a fun little background element, right? That they had released this thing onto the world. And if you were playing like a regular campaign with maybe more of a story arc, this is kind of a good story arc, right? Where it's like, even if you didn't start that way, this becomes a story arc where hopefully your players want to stop what they started, right? So they can do it any number of ways, either by getting more powerful themselves, figuring out some way to, trap the things, even, with some kind of help from a powerful wizard or a magic item. Or, they enlist an army, or they confess that they're the ones that let them out, or they go back to the place where they were released from and look for more hints, right? And this is how we kind of build out our campaign and let the players' actions do stuff. Now, if they just don't do anything about it, that's also fine, right? How does the rest of the world react and what goes on? Does somebody eventually stop this thing? I mean, in a classic fantasy campaign, you are going to have, even though I said, quote, realistic, there's still going to be other 5th level fighters. So somebody will eventually confront this army. How much havoc it causes, how much destruction is in its wake. If people find out the PCs were the one that let it out, that's all, again, consequences and part of the game. And something that you might want to you could either logic out, I guess, if the PCs left obvious signs that it was them, or you could leave it to the luck of the dice. Anyway, right? And again, that can also shape the campaign. These are consequences. They're not immediately like, we know you did it. You've got to kind of make it feel like it works. So again, in that one, it was more kind of background, like, oh God, they kept getting further from it. Like every time they would hear about the warriors, they'd try to get further and further away because they didn't want to be connected with it, right? And again, that was more kind of a fun, freewheeling, roguish campaign, if you will. So they weren't, and it was more kind of, it wasn't, it was just a series of one-shots really put together. So they never defeated the army, and it kind of kept going on. But tied into classic fiction, there's a story, a Conan story, a Robert E. Howard Conan story that is called Black Colossus. And in the beginning of this story, this happens in like the first couple pages, so it's not a big spoiler, there is a master thief that breaks into this tomb to steal some treasure or whatever, but inside this tomb is what is effectively a lich, right? The master thief is, of course, killed, and then the story progresses from there. And what's funny is, this is a good example. We go out and read Black Colossus. You should be able to find it online. I'm pretty sure all the stuff's in public domain from Weird Tales. In fact, and again, a little spoiler here, but basically this happens, and then it kind of jumps to the future, and lots of other things are going on, and we find that a mystical figure has been raising armies and causing, issues in the South or whatever, maybe the North, I don't know. But anyways, the idea is that this thief that released this lich caused a consequence that then became a major thing in the world that needed to be dealt with. Not dealt with by them because they were dead, right? So keep in mind that if the player characters release something and die, so you're playing a low-level campaign, let's say, and you have first, second level characters, and they do something bad and they release something. And again, don't set this up, like don't plan this, but if it happens organically, something is released that they can't deal with and they run from, like those warriors, you can have it come back much later, right? You can wait. Like I was, again, just peppering it in for flavor, but you could also have them release the warriors and then just play for 6 months and then have them find out that this other thing has happened. And now they are higher level and now there are other things going on. Now they have more resources. So maybe they do try to challenge it, right? So this is something that can come back. You want to use what's happening to form what could happen in the future, but you don't want to push any particular agenda. They could still choose just not to get involved. That's also fine. But I think this is a great example of like letting loose an evil and then like not being there to deal with it. Again, you could, even if you run multiple groups, let's say you run one shots once in a while, and you run one where something happens and the group, it's a one shot, they don't kind of play those characters anymore. You could bring the results of those consequences of that happening to your other table, right? This happened in a far off land and now it's starting to affect you here. And I think that can be really fun. You could do this with solo gaming like I do. I'll do some solo stuff, and sometimes I'll use things that happen in my solo game and I'll pour them back over into my table. You could read a book and just pretend that happened in your world, right? This person was released and these are the consequences. So all of this stuff kind of works together. And again, consequences should be stuff the player characters are doing, but it doesn't have to be, right? It could be consequences from avoiding something. That is to say, they have the opportunity to stop this group of roving bandits who are harassing this one town when there's only 20 or 30 bandits in the group. But they ignore them, and later the bandit group becomes more powerful. They take over the town. Now the trail between these two, other areas is blocked because the bandits have taken over, and there's tolls and everything else. So now travel becomes harder, right? The consequence isn't they screwed up and now they're paying a consequence. The consequence is they ignored something. And this is not a penalty to the players because, in fact, this should happen all the time. In my game, my current campaign, the player characters don't do a lot of stuff. They don't do way more than they do because obviously the whole world's moving around them and they can't do everything. So sometimes they gotta say, we're leaving the bandits for somebody else. And again, it can then come back to be a problem in the future, or it could resolve itself, right? That's the other thing that you want to have going on in these games is that the player characters aren't the only heroes in the world, and things will get resolved, for good or bad, right? If they hear that there's a bunch of treasure and they wait too long to go look for it, maybe somebody else gets the treasure, right? If they don't stop a group of bandits, maybe somebody else does. These things can all happen, and they should happen, right? It's not like once you release something, it's up for the players to just deal with it. Sometimes, going back to Black Colossus, somebody else has to deal with the mistake that you made because you died. Another very classic example that maybe people don't think of all the time as consequences is The Hobbit, right? In the story The Hobbit, again, spoilers for The Hobbit, I guess, they awaken a dragon that has been, fairly dormant for a long time in order to steal the dragon's treasure. I know with the idea that they're hoping they're going to defeat the dragon somehow, but effectively the dragon leaves and they're all happy, right? But this dragon then goes and wreaks havoc in other places. Now, again, the dragon flies off and wreaks havoc. Again, spoilers for The Hobbit. Somebody else deals with the dragon. So you might say, well, there was no consequence for them getting the dragon out of there. They get all the treasure. Well, if you read the story, there is a consequence because those who dealt with the dragon and were damaged by the dragon or hurt by the dragon now want their reparations, right? So then they go back to the dwarves and try to get some of the dragon's treasure. So again, the consequence here is they release the dragon. The consequence isn't they have to fight the dragon. The consequence is they now have to deal with the people who had to fight the dragon, right? And this is, again, longer, deeper world building than just you did this thing as an immediate reaction. It's not you woke the dragon, now you have to fight it. It's like a bigger, and in some ways a more logical progression, right? Because the dragon, of course, had no way of suspecting, except for via Bilbo's, goof up, who woke him, right? Because he had never smelled a hobbit before. So all this kind of ties in, and you just have to kind of think about your world and what's going on there. And I guess if I'm going to mention the Hobbit, moving into the other books, right? The ring itself is a long-term consequence, right? The ring being found, then dug back up, is a consequence. It was the fact that it wasn't destroyed, and whatever. I'm not a Tolkien lore expert, but it wasn't destroyed, right? The ring was off in the world, right? And because of this, eventually we get what is the Lord of the Rings. So these things, again, can happen from one campaign to another. They could be immediate or somewhat immediate in your campaign. They could be caused by other people. They could be caused by things that player characters ignore. There's lots of ways to do these consequences that doesn't feel like I'm just coming down and slapping you on the wrist because you're not doing what I want. I think that's not how you want consequences to be. I think you want them to feel like what would naturally progress in the world if the player characters did something or didn't do something. So with all this being said, remember that the game is supposed to be fun, right? And the game is supposed to be challenging, and every group is going to want to play differently. And if you are playing with a group that doesn't want to remember what they did yesterday, and they're just going into a dungeon and they're fighting monsters and they're getting treasure, then you don't necessarily have to worry too far outside of what they're immediately doing. The consequences of the mega dungeon might be you defeated this group of orcs, now somebody else is going to take over their area, right? It leaves a gap, which could then bring in different monsters, or it could, an immediate consequence might be it's easier to pass through that level because the orcs are now gone. A negative consequence might be something else more powerful might move in, or possibly some orcs that survived might, go after the party because they're the last remaining, orcs of this group. So, and that might happen down the road, right? They might leave and come back. They might raise a different army. They might go, all these things can tie in. You just have to kind of think about what would logically work and what makes sense and what's fun for your group. Don't ignore what they do and don't do, but don't shove it down their throats either. If they pass by this small group of bandits, don't make it that, oh, well, you didn't do that. Now the whole campaign is ground to a halt because now all of a sudden there's 1,000 bandits and it's some kind of crazy thing. No, it doesn't have to be that, right? But it can very well be that somebody asked for their help and they didn't do it. So later when they need help, they don't get it. Let me know what you think about this impact and consequences. How do you play them out the table? Do you run more kind of open world and kind of let's see where things go? Or do you have a little bit more of a storyline? And if you do, how do you handle consequences then? If you're running a more linear campaign, consequences are a little bit trickier, I think, because you don't want to send people so far off the linear story that they're kind of playing through, right? So if you're playing that kind of thing, you don't want to send them way off to the south. So you got to be careful about what you put in front of them and what you make a consequence if they don't interact with it. Anyways, check the description below. You'll find links to my Discord server if you want to sign up over there, join the conversation. You can find links to my t-shirts if you want a t-shirt. You can, do all kinds of stuff. Live your life. Play your game. Anyways, I'll talk to you soon.